Elena Vasquez handed over a single-dollar bill for a structure that had been sealed for 40 years. The bunker looked like it should have cost nothing, maybe less than nothing, considering someone would need to clear the land eventually. But Colonel Raymond Hollis took that dollar with a tight-lipped smile, signed the transfer papers without reading them twice, and drove away faster than a man should drive from something he just sold. Elena stood there holding the documents, watching Hollis's black sedan disappear down the desert highway, and felt the first cold knot of unease tighten in her gut. Why would a retired military officer sell government surplus property for the price of a coffee? Especially property he'd personally overseen before his discharge? The bunker's steel doors were crusted with decades of rust and desert sand. Concrete walls jutted from the barren New Mexico earth like broken teeth, half buried by time and neglect. The ventilation shafts that once circulated air through underground corridors now whistled with wind that sounded almost like voices calling up from somewhere deep below. Most people would see a liability, a cleanup nightmare that would cost more than it was worth. Elena saw salvage. Enough steel, copper wiring, and vintage equipment to keep her struggling architectural salvage business afloat through another lean quarter. Simple mathematics. $1 in, maybe $6,000 out if she worked it carefully and sold to the right collectors. But when Elena descended the entry stairs with Luna at her side, the mathematics stopped making sense. The Belgian Malinois froze 5 steps below ground level, ears flat against her skull, every muscle locked beneath her tan and black coat. Luna never acted like that. Not during their years working together, not during building inspections in condemned warehouses, not around anything that belonged in the world Elena understood. The air below tasted wrong, chemical and stale, like breathing through a mask that had filtered something toxic decades ago and never quite cleared. And the walls, those reinforced concrete walls, seemed to absorb sound in ways that defied natural acoustics. Distances felt distorted. Corners disappeared into darkness that her industrial flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. Elena ran her hand along the corridor wall and felt a faint vibration pass through the concrete, as if the structure itself carried an electrical current that shouldn't exist in a facility that had been without power for 4 decades. Luna pressed hard against her leg and gave a low, anxious whine that Elena hadn't heard since the dog was a young trainee learning to detect structural instabilities. That night, back in her small apartment in Alamogordo, Elena couldn't stop thinking about Hollis's rushed departure, about the papers signed too quickly, about the way the bunker seemed to hum when no power source touched it, as if the dollar hadn't bought a decommissioned military structure at all, but something waiting inside it. Something that had been sealed away for a reason. 3 weeks before Elena Vasquez bought the bunker, she counted the balance in her business account and knew she wouldn't make it to spring. $4,200 stood between her and bankruptcy. Between her and the kind of failure that makes a woman question every risk she's taken since leaving her corporate architecture job to start her own business. Her architectural salvage company, 2 part-time employees and a cramped warehouse space, barely covered operating costs. Most months she paid her team before herself, and Elena wouldn't have it any other way. They'd believed in her vision when no one else did. She was at the Otero County Records office in Alamogordo researching foreclosure properties when she overheard 2 clerks talking near the copy machine. Their words drifted across the fluorescent-lit room like a lifeline or a noose, you don't know which until you grab hold. One said Colonel Hollis was liquidating his property holdings, trying to unload the old Project Nightfall bunker out past Holloman Air Force Base. The other laughed that no one would touch that Cold War relic unless Hollis paid them to deal with the environmental cleanup. But Elena heard something else. $6,000 in salvageable materials if a woman worked smart enough. Vintage military equipment that collectors paid premium prices for. Copper wiring that was worth its weight. Potentially intact Cold War-era fixtures that museums and private buyers sought desperately. That evening, she found Hollis at a veterans center on the outskirts of town, sitting alone in a leather chair near a window with a view of the San Andres Mountains. He was older, maybe 72, silver haircut, military short, spine still rigid despite decades of retirement. His suit was expensive, tailored, the kind of clothing that spoke of a man who'd done well after his service ended. But his eyes told a different story. They were haunted, restless, moving constantly as if searching for threats that only he could see. His gaze slid away when he spoke to the receptionist, never holding contact. Elena had learned to distrust men who looked everywhere but at you. When Elena approached and mentioned the bunker, Hollis's weathered hand tightened around the armrest of his chair. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then his expression smoothed flat, carefully neutral, like a door slamming shut on whatever emotion had flickered there. "You want to buy it?" "Depends on the price," Elena said, keeping her voice level and professional. $1. Elena stared at him. Property had value simply for existing. Even contaminated government land sold for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. Even if it cost money to remediate, the land itself held worth. She thought she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say?" $1, Hollis repeated, his voice flat and final. "Take it or leave it." He already had the transfer papers in hand, pulling them from an attaché case beside his chair as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask. Already holding out a government pen with faded gold trim. "I want it gone. Off my conscience. Off my property records. Gone." That word, conscience, caught like a fishhook in Elena's mind, sharp and uncomfortable. A career military officer with 4 decades of service didn't use that word lightly. Didn't sell valuable property for pocket change unless something heavy pressed on his soul. But Elena was desperate, and desperation makes you sign things you might not sign in clearer circumstances. She handed over the dollar bill she'd been saving for lunch, and Hollis signed with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. He walked away without looking back, moving quickly for a man his age, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor with urgent rhythm. Elena sat alone in the lobby with the papers, sunlight streaming through the windows, wondering what kind of structure pressed so heavily on a decorated soldier's conscience that he'd sell it for the price of a candy bar. Elena returned to the bunker the next morning with Luna trotting beside her and a full exploration kit strapped to her back. The drive took 50 minutes from Alamogordo, following Highway 54 north before turning onto a series of unmarked dirt roads that wound through scrubland that stretched flat and empty under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Hollis's face, that momentary tightening in his jaw, the way his hands had trembled when signing, that word about conscience echoing in her mind like a warning she didn't yet understand. A woman didn't sell military property for $1 unless something was catastrophically wrong with it, or unless something was buried inside it that needed to stay buried, and the guilt of that burial had finally become too much to bear. The bunker looked worse in the harsh morning sunlight. The concrete had weathered to the color of old bone, cracked and pitted from decades of temperature extremes that could swing 40 degrees between day and night in the New Mexico desert. Rust covered every exposed metal surface like a virulent disease, eating through bolts and hinges and door frames until they looked ready to crumble into iron oxide dust at the slightest touch. The heavy steel security doors stood half open, wedged by accumulated sand and debris, revealing darkness that seemed to actively resist the daylight, as if the shadows inside had weight and substance. Elena circled the structure twice before considering entry, her architect's eye studying the reinforcement patterns, looking for structural damage or contamination warnings or anything that would explain why a rational man would essentially give away government property. The entrance showed surprisingly little damage. The ventilation system appeared intact, though clearly non-functional. The concrete reinforcement looked solid despite its age. Strange. A facility this old, this neglected, should have shown catastrophic deterioration. Should have been stripped by scavengers or sealed by the government with condemned signs and razor wire. Luna stopped at the threshold of the steel doors, ears flat against her head, body rigid as if she'd encountered an invisible wall. The dog stared into the darkness beyond the entry and would not move forward. Elena had never seen her act this way. Not once in the 6 years since she brought the young dog home from a police K-9 washout program. Luna had explored collapsed buildings, descended into flooded basements, walked through fire-damaged structures without hesitation. But this stopped her cold. Elena crouched down and ran her hand through the thick fur on Luna's neck, feeling the profound tension there, the muscles drawn tight as steel cables ready to snap. The dog's heart was racing, hammering against her ribs like she'd just run a mile at full sprint. "It's just a bunker, girl," Elena said softly, more to reassure herself than the dog. "Just concrete and steel and old memories." But when she stepped across the threshold, when the desert sunlight fell away and the underground darkness embraced her, she understood with absolute certainty why Luna had refused. The air felt fundamentally different here, heavier, pressing against her skin and lungs like breathing through something more viscous than atmosphere. It wasn't just stale or musty, it felt wrong, like the molecular composition had been altered by whatever had happened in these corridors decades ago. And the smell, that chemical taste she'd noticed during her brief first visit yesterday, was much stronger now, more complex. It reminded her of hospitals, of sealed laboratories, of rooms where dangerous things were kept sterile and hidden from anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. She clicked on her high-powered flashlight and swept it across the entrance corridor. The beam pushed back shadows but somehow made the space look more ominous, more threatening. The concrete walls weren't just gray, they were marked with stains that looked almost organic, spreading across the surface in patterns that resembled branching veins or nerve networks. Water damage, probably, her rational mind insisted. Just mineral deposits from decades of condensation. But her instincts, honed by years of evaluating dangerous structures, screamed something different. The walls were marked with stenciled warnings in faded yellow paint that seemed to glow faintly in her flashlight beam. "Authorized personnel only. Level 4 clearance required. Biological containment protocols in effect. Decontamination mandatory." Elena felt her chest tighten, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Biological containment. Level 4 clearance. This wasn't just a bomb shelter or communications post or ammunition depot. This had been something else entirely. Something that required the highest military security classifications. She moved deeper into the bunker, her boots echoing on concrete floors that felt too solid, too carefully engineered for a simple Cold War refuge meant to protect personnel from nuclear fallout. The sound of her footsteps was wrong, too absorbed and deadened by the walls in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if the concrete contained materials specifically designed to prevent sound transmission. The corridor branched left and right after 20 yards. Faded signs pointed left toward Research Wing and right toward Administrative Section and Containment Units 1 to 12. Containment Units. Elena's mouth went dry. She chose left, following painted arrows that led toward the Research Wing, Luna reluctantly trailing several feet behind, whining softly with every step. The first rooms she passed were stripped completely bare, empty chambers with exposed wiring and rectangular shadows on the concrete where heavy equipment had once been bolted to the floor and walls. Someone had methodically removed everything, leaving only mounting brackets and disconnected cables that spoke of urgent evacuation. But the fifth room was different. The door hung partially ajar, steel hinges corroded but still functional, and inside, tall filing cabinets still lined the walls like silent sentinels guarding secrets. Elena pushed the door fully open, and dust swirled in her flashlight beam like disturbed spirits finally released from decades of confinement. The cabinets were industrial gray, military issue, each drawer secured with combination locks that had long since rusted into uselessness. She wedged her crowbar into the first lock and applied pressure. The mechanism resisted, then surrendered with a shriek of protesting metal. The drawer slid open, and inside, manila folders packed so tightly they'd compressed into a single mass. Each folder was labeled with alphanumeric designation codes that meant nothing to her: PN 78-042, PN 78-043, PN 78-044, continuing in sequential order. She pulled one at random, PN 78-067, and opened it with hands that had begun to tremble. The first page was a test subject profile. Name, redacted. Age, 24. Gender, female. Status, military volunteer. Initial exposure date, June 15, 1978. Handler, Colonel Hollis. Elena's blood turned to ice. Hollis. The man who'd sold her this place for $1 had been directly involved in whatever happened here. The pages that followed documented something that made Elena's hands go cold despite the stuffy underground heat. Physiological changes measured daily. Psychological deterioration tracked on standardized assessment forms. Behavioral modifications noted with clinical detachment. And at the bottom of the last page, stamped in red ink that had faded to rust brown, termination date, July 3, 1978. Cause, irreversible neurological damage. Disposition, cremated per Protocol 7A. 18 days. This woman had survived 18 days. Elena grabbed another folder with shaking hands. Same pattern. Male, age 27, military volunteer, initial exposure June 20, 1978, termination July 8, 1978. Another volunteer. Another death. She pulled open more drawers, crowbar working frantically now, and found 23 folders in the first cabinet alone. 23 people. 23 terminations. Every single one dead within weeks of initial exposure to something the documents referred to only as compound Zeta-9. She found a second cabinet and forced it open. Technical reports. Chemical formulas written in notation she didn't understand. Test protocols for something called enhanced interrogation substrate, neural pathway disruption applications. Notes about controllable memory suppression. About permanent psychological modification. About breaking a human mind so completely it could be rebuilt into something else entirely. Her hands were shaking violently now as she photographed pages with her phone, the flash creating stark shadows in the abandoned room. This wasn't weapons research. This wasn't developing better bombs or missiles or tactical advantages. This was human experimentation. Illegal, classified, buried 40 years ago when someone at the Pentagon or CIA or some alphabet agency decided the project had crossed too many ethical lines, produced too many bodies, attracted too much potential scrutiny. And Hollis had commanded it. Had overseen these experiments. Had signed off on protocols that killed 23 people, probably more. These were just the files in one cabinet, in the name of national security and scientific advancement. Elena stepped back from the cabinets, her mind reeling with implications. How many people had died in this bunker? How many families never learned what happened to their sons and daughters who'd volunteered for classified military research and never came home? And why had Hollis sold this place for $1 instead of having it demolished, filled with concrete, buried under 50 feet of sand where no one would ever find it? The answer crystallized with terrible clarity, because he couldn't anymore. Because his authority had expired with his retirement. Because whatever shadow organization had protected this facility for decades had finally abandoned it, and Hollis, old, dying, consumed by guilt, had made one final decision. Not to destroy the evidence himself, which would require resources and permissions he no longer had. But to sell it. To make it someone else's problem. Someone else's discovery. To let the truth finally emerge while maintaining plausible deniability. He'd transferred his guilt along with that deed. Luna's warning bark shattered her thoughts, a sharp, urgent sound that Elena had learned to recognize as imminent danger. She grabbed 4 folders, stuffed them inside her jacket against her ribs, and moved quickly toward the door. The dog's barking grew more frantic, echoing through the empty concrete corridors with increasing desperation. Elena stepped into the hallway and immediately understood why. Light. Not from her flashlight. Bright LED light spilling down the corridor from the entrance like a flood, accompanied by the sound of multiple footsteps descending the stairs with military precision. And voices. Professional. Cold. Purposeful. Ms. Vasquez? A woman's voice called out, sharp and authoritative. Colonel Hollis informed us you might be here. We need to have a conversation about what you've just purchased and what you may have found. Elena's hand went instinctively to her phone, but the screen showed no signal this far underground, no way to call for help or document what was happening. Luna positioned herself between Elena and the approaching voices, teeth bared, a continuous low growl building in her chest that vibrated through the stale air. The folders against Elena's ribs felt like they weighed 100 pounds. Evidence of crimes that should have destroyed careers, sparked congressional investigations, ended lives in prison. And the people walking toward her through the darkness with their bright tactical lights and measured footsteps were here to make absolutely certain that evidence never saw daylight. Never reached journalists or lawyers or anyone who might care that 23 Americans had been murdered in the name of classified research. Elena killed her flashlight and moved silently deeper into the bunker, Luna at her heels, her architect's memory reconstructing the floor plan from the brief glimpse she'd had of a schematic near the entrance. Knowing with terrible certainty that the simple salvage job she'd imagined, the business-saving score that would pull her from the edge of bankruptcy, had just become something infinitely more dangerous. Colonel Hollis hadn't sold her a bunker for $1. He'd sold her a secret that powerful people had killed to protect 40 years ago. And they were prepared to kill again. Elena ran deeper into the bunker's darkness, Luna's claws scraping concrete as they navigated by memory alone. Behind them, tactical lights swept the corridors in coordinated patterns. Professional. Military. These weren't private security guards, these were operatives trained to eliminate problems quietly. "Ms. Vasquez, you're making this harder than it needs to be," the woman's voice echoed through the corridors. "Closer now. We just want to talk about what you found. Come out, and we can reach an arrangement." An arrangement. Elena knew what that meant. The files pressed against her ribs felt like they were burning through her jacket. 23 dead volunteers. Decades of cover-up. And she'd just become witness number 24. She pulled Luna into a side room, one of the stripped chambers she'd passed earlier. Her fingers found her phone, switched it to camera mode, and began frantically photographing every page of the 4 folders she'd taken. No signal, but the photos would upload automatically once she reached the surface. If she reached the surface. Footsteps stopped outside her hiding place. A tactical light swept across the doorway. Motion sensor picked up something in Research Wing C, a male voice reported. 2 heat signatures. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Luna tensed, ready to attack on command. She had maybe 30 seconds before they found her. Her thumb moved frantically across the phone screen, photographing page after page, test results, termination orders, Hollis's signature authorizing each death. The light beam entered the room. "Contact," the male voice said. Elena threw the folders at them, papers exploding into the air like white birds taking flight, and ran in the opposite direction as Luna launched herself at the nearest operative. Shouting. A weapon discharged, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Luna yelped but kept fighting. Elena's boots pounded concrete as she navigated the maze of corridors by pure instinct. Left, right, through a door marked Containment Unit 7. Behind her, more footsteps, more voices coordinating her capture. She burst through another door and found herself in a larger chamber, some kind of observation room with reinforced glass windows looking into sealed testing cells. And there, mounted on the wall, a red emergency phone. Ancient. Hardwired. Connected to something that might still work. She grabbed it, nearly sobbing with relief when she heard a dial tone. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm being attacked in the old Project Nightfall bunker, 20 miles north of Holloman Air Force Base. I've discovered evidence of illegal human experimentation, 23 people murdered by the military in 1978. I need. The door exploded inward. 3 operatives, weapons raised. Police immediately. I'm uploading evidence to cloud storage right now. If I die here, the files go public automatically. A bluff. She had no cloud upload, no automated system. Just photos on a phone with no signal. But they didn't know that. The lead operative, a woman in her 40s with cold gray eyes, lowered her weapon slightly. You don't understand what you're interfering with. I understand 23 Americans are dead. I understand Colonel Hollis sold me this bunker because his conscience finally broke. And I understand you're here to add me to that body count. Those volunteers knew the risks. They served their country. They were murdered. and their families deserve to know. The operative's jaw tightened. Elena could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, weighing the risk of killing her now against the possibility that evidence had already escaped. The sound of distant sirens made the decision for her. "This isn't over," the woman said, and signaled her team to withdraw. They disappeared into the darkness, moving with the same professional silence they'd arrived with. Luna limped to Elena's side, bleeding from a graze wound but alive. Elena slid down the wall, phone clutched in shaking hands, and waited for the police she'd called to arrive. 3 weeks later, Elena sat in a federal courtroom in Albuquerque. The folders she'd photographed were projected on screens: Colonel Hollis's signature, the termination orders, the clinical notes documenting each volunteer's deterioration and death. 23 names that had been buried for 40 years now read aloud in a room full of journalists, lawyers, and families who'd never known what happened to their loved ones. Hollis sat in the gallery, hands folded in his lap, tears streaming down his weathered face. He'd known this day would come when he sold that bunker. He'd wanted it to come. Needed someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig up what he'd buried. The judge ordered a full investigation. Criminal charges were filed against 3 surviving Project Nightfall administrators. Compensation was promised to the families, though money could never restore what was stolen. Elena walked out of the courthouse into bright New Mexico sunshine, Luna at her side, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Her salvage business had failed, she'd spent every penny on lawyers and court costs. But she'd salvaged something more valuable than vintage fixtures and copper wiring. She'd salvaged the truth. And 23 forgotten volunteers could finally rest.